this presentation, we'll be discussing habitat selection, and we start off by looking at ecosystem variables. As a reminder, landscape ecology is really about this interplay between landscape patterns and the influences of those patterns on ecosystem processes. And traditionally, landscape ecologists would focus mainly on the driving factors of landscape heterogeneity, such as abiotic factors or disturbance, and look at the influences of those driving factors on the landscape patterns, composition, and configuration. However, in more recent studies, there's an interplay or an influence of the ecosystem processes and how those have an impact on landscape heterogeneity. So there's really a shift to more of this integration between landscape ecology and ecosystem processes, which is why it's important to have a good understanding of those ecosystem variables. There are several different important landscape elements to understanding these patterns, including the climate gradients, such as latitudinal or altitudinal, soils, topographic relief, so elements such as slope and aspect, as well as things like runoff and run-on and runoff. And there are also very relevant and important ecosystem elements to be aware of, including primary productivity and the flow of energy, the biogeochemical cycle, the movement of materials, and more modernly or more recently, climate change. So, in first taking a look at global patterns of net primary productivity and focusing on the terrestrial applications, we oftentimes want to understand the annual net primary productivity and the fact that it will vary oftentimes with moisture. Contours or isopleths of this distribution demonstrate throughout the year how the change is going to be dependent on the amount of rain and the type of ecosystem. So net primary productivity is closely tied to this amount of water, which is why it's important to understand water availability as well. Biogeochemical cycling is the natural pathways by which essential elements of living matter are circulated. So we could talk about this in terms of nutrients or carbon, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle. There's various different specific nutrient cycles or cycles that you can look at. One good example of reasons why this can influence or greatly influence the landscape and the habitat selection of a species is due to something called eutrophication. Eutrophication is where you have an increase in some nutrient, which results in an algal bloom, which ultimately leads to an increased decomposition of those organisms that had bloomed, and finally a decreased dissolved oxygen level. So these types of this eutrophication process can have some major impacts on the organisms as well as the resource availability of other resources, such as water, viable water for ingestion. And the amount of eutrophication is really going to depend on the watershed. So here we're kind of establishing that habitat selection is based on ecosystem variables. However, those ecosystem variables are going to be influenced and impacted by these different processes. The movement of material is really referring to organisms, nutrients, and other materials that move within and between ecosystems. So in the bottom figure here, we have some examples of wind moving sand. We have caribou in the bottom left that are migrating across a habitat. In the upper left-hand corner, we have clouds and currents moving across the Gulf of Mexico. And the upper right-hand corner, we have an example of rock fall from a cliff. So all of these different mechanisms are going to move materials from one place to another in a habitat. Rainfall runoff is going to be an important element that can influence habitat selection. For this, we obviously have to understand watersheds and how water moves throughout a habitat based on the different topographical characteristics. We also have to have a good understanding of run-on areas, which is regions where there's going to be an accumulation of material. These tend to be more productive and thus are going to be more influential in habitat selection. In addition to these methods or mechanisms of moving materials, we also have vectors, which is going to be anything that's going to transport materials. And quite often we'll hear of vectors referring to birds and insects and bats and other pollinating creatures. So in addition to the abiotic factors that can be vectors, such as wind and water, we also have biotic factors that are able to move resources. Finally, climate change impacts are important to understand. Anthropogenic activities can influence and change the mean conditions and climate variability within an ecosystem, which can in turn have a big effect on the selection of the habitat for a species. Oftentimes, if you look at this on a more local level, we see that there are influences such as rising temperatures in the upper left-hand figure, overall shrinking snowpack in the upper right-hand figure, at least predictions anyway. In the bottom left-hand side, we find that there are shorter, more intense wet seasons, and in the bottom right-hand figure, we have an indication of predictions for the volatile precipitation that can occur in between extremely wet and extremely dry years. So there's an increase in a lot of these features, and we can use this information to better understand habitat selection and at least try and use it to predict how species may change their habitat over time. Finally, we can look at land-to-sea connections in helping us to understand habitat selection. In this particular figure, we see major rivers in the United States, represented by the dark blue line, and you can clearly see that these rivers connect the inland regions of the United States to the shore regions, with major kind of outputs occurring in the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River, the Colorado River into the Gulf of California, and the Columbia River off the coast of the U.S. West Coast there. There's also near-shore communities and estuaries that share this land and sea link. And in this particular figure, we see an estuary which, on the left-hand side, is introducing fresh water into the system via the tidal river, and ultimately is also introducing salt water via the entrance to the ocean. So there's certainly this important link between the land and sea that can have a great influence on the productivity as well as the habitat structure in these regions. Trees can have a large influence on habitats as well. Within streams, a tree can represent or turn into a new habitat. It can also trap sediment, cover and block water flow, which is another thing that can occur within estuaries. Oftentimes it'll act as perching habitat for birds. And these are all trees that naturally die and fall and just float down the river, ultimately ending up in these estuaries via the tidal river. The ocean or beach can also be influenced by these dead trees. They can be used, or they essentially can trap sand, act as floating logs to attract fish, and be useful in terms of energy and shelter. Fish migrations can also have an influence on ecosystem variables. And we find that there's two kind of life cycles of certain fish wherein there's going to be movement of material from a freshwater environment to a marine environment. The first is the anadromous life cycle, where freshwater fish, or fish that are born in freshwater, ultimately migrate to an estuary until they're adult size and then live part of their, or most of their adult life in a marine environment, returning to that freshwater in order to lay their eggs. And the opposite is true in a catadromous life cycle, wherein they are born at sea and then migrate as adults to a freshwater environment. And perhaps the most widely known of these anadromous life cycles is that of the salmon. The adults live at sea until they're approximately 5 years old, and then they swim upstream to spawn. They actually die after the spawning, so you end up with this mass amount of decomposing bodies that occurs along the shores and within these freshwater habitats. The decomposing bodies are going to ultimately contribute nutrients to the surrounding terrestrial ecosystems, in addition to the freshwater habitats. So a large run of salmon can contribute approximately 60,000 tons of fish, which equates to about 198 tons of nitrogen. And most of this nitrogen is going to stay upstream and be kind of absorbed and utilized by the ecosystem in terms of the trees that are going to utilize some of this nitrogen from the soil. Other organisms such as bears, small predators, and scavengers are supported by the food of these fish, all dying off. And as you can see, the range of the sockeyed salmon pictured in the bottom left-hand corner, the bottom left picture, is going to be quite extensive, because in the figure to the bottom right, we see that all of the orange region contributes to the freshwater existence of this sockeyed salmon, or the range. So these fish can travel quite far inland and contribute a really significant amount of resources to those environments. So you can understand how having a reduction in that fish stock or having some other large influence on the capability of that fish to return home to spawn can greatly damage surrounding ecosystems. Let's take a closer look at habitats as an overview here. So habitat is the physical and biological factors in geography that support a species' survival and reproduction. It differs from a niche in that a niche is going to be a section of that habitat that an animal tends to occupy in order to increase its survivability as well as its fitness. So habitats are species specific, and they're reliant on the resources that the species needs. You can have specialists that require very, very specific resources, such as food, or they could be generalists, which means they can eat a range of food or require a range of resources. There's also habitats also have the ability to support a population and can include two or more types of habitat. And by this we mean a habitat can be said to include a breeding area as well as a feeding area for a particular organism. So when you discuss these habitats, sometimes they are paired regions that you're discussing for an individual species. How a species selects a habitat is an important thing to understand as well. Habitat selection is the process of a species' behavior by which a habitat is selected. It can be based on either the proximate factors that guide selection and ultimate factors, which essentially are going to refer to the adaptability of the species to that habitat. It's very important not only in terms of describing things such as population density, but also the population distribution of an organism, as well as if its pervasiveness and its occurrence and ability to kind of infest a region, such as in invasive species. Originally, Fretwell and Lucas in 1972 described the ideal free distribution model. This figure provides an example of it, wherein the red line is going to represent a poor patch that's not going to be as preferable to a species, and the blue line is going to represent a good patch, or a really good suitable habitat for an organism. And essentially, the ideal free distribution model predicts the distribution of individuals in habitats, both in that poor as well as that good habitat. And it demonstrates that as more individuals arrive and occupy a good quality habitat, the poor quality habitat becomes more comparable and thus more preferable. The habitat quality is thus going to be density dependent. So if you have a habitat that's preferable to a species, it's only preferable so long as that there's a limited number of the same species that are present, or individuals that are present within that region. So essentially that habitat quality is going to relate to the increased fitness potential of an individual. There's also the site dependence model that was described by Rodenhouse et al. In 1997, and it's an alternative to that ideal free distribution model, which, just as a reminder, in the upper set of figures, we have a small population size on the left and a larger population size on the right-hand side. And in the bottom panel, we see that these smaller populations and the larger populations can actually be influenced not only just by the overall population size, but also the suitability. So the suitability will decline across all sites, site holders or individuals in a population as the population size increases. And in here we see that the darker rocks are going, or patches, are going to be representative of high suitability, and ultimately you get down to the wider space striped circles on the right-hand side that are representative of low suitability. So by comparison with site dependence, it allows you to predict the distributions among the habitats, and also states that when the population decreases, only the suitable sites are going to be occupied, which results in population growth. It operates in a wide range of spatial scales for species distributed both in small habitats as well as widely. And in this figure, we can see that we have the same thing happening. On the left-hand side are smaller populations, and the right-hand side is the scenario as there's an increase in the population size. And ultimately, an increased population size can result in either the decreased average suitability per site, which will result in sites that are of medium as well as low suitability. Also, it can result in a change or reduction in the population density, an increase in the population density, but ultimately that population size is going to increase because of the fact that you still have some of those low suitability sites that are going to be highly occupied, since they can't all be in that high suitability regions. They start branching out, moving into those medium and low suitability regions as well, or patches. Ecological traps are another interesting thing to consider with respect to habitat selection. Essentially, rapid environmental changes can lead organisms to settle in poor habitats. And in habitats that are altered by humans, it results in formerly reliable environmental cues being no longer associated with adaptive outcomes or successful outcomes. And essentially this leads to poor habitat selection or choices by an organism or an individual. So in this particular figure, in the top panel, we have the original environment with the original cue and the original response, which is where you have the expected outcome and thus no trap. However, if that organism, such as in the middle panel, is in a new environment but still is relying on that original cue and original response, it may result in an unexpected outcome, which we can refer to as an evolutionary trap or an ecological trap. In the final panel, you have a second new environment where you have an organism making a new cue that mimics the original one, and hopefully soliciting an original response. However, the fact that it's a new cue may actually result in an unexpected outcome as well. And a good example of this is in this species of cardinal and these honeysuckles, Asian honeysuckles that are represented within Ohio and other parts of the country. And essentially, the honeysuckles have grown rampantly. They're an invasive species that's been extensively found, and initially, a lot of birders were stating that the populations of birds was increasing in connection to the increase in this invasive species of honeysuckle. However, a study by Rodewald in 2011 found that while there was an increase in the population density, the honeysuckle berries actually have the same pigmentation, so they still provide that red color to the birds, but there's less protein and fat, which are really required for the overall fitness of these birds. So the red Q, the deeper, darker red Q of a male bird is usually indicative of a highly fit individual and something that a female will use to determine a mate. So this particular population of birds still has that red Q and still has the dark red Q to them. However, their intake of protein and fat is drastically reduced, which means that their level of fitness is not as high. And so essentially that red Q, which is supposed to indicate fitness, is lost. Or it's mitigated, I should say. Not quite as useful in selecting a mate. And they found that there's an overall reduction in the number of nests as well for this particular species. Of course, there's many examples of this. Mayflies actually were found by Kriska et al. In 1998 to be laying their eggs on asphalt. And it's largely because of the fact that the asphalt roads mimic the reflection of light in the same way that pond water does. So the insects are looking for this reflective value or feature that it typically finds in ponds, pond water. And instead of laying them in the correct habitat, they actually are laying, or were laying, all of those eggs on asphalt, which is not going to be viable for the eggs. Of course, there's many examples of this that are influenced by humans. In the upper left-hand panel here, picture, we have these frogs that are, this frog that is misidentifying a light as a source of food. And of course, in the upper right-hand panel, we've all heard a lot about plastic being ingested by birds and other sea creatures, and that plastic ultimately building up in the stomachs of these animals so they're no longer hungry. So they're picking up on these cues and essentially getting kind of trapped into these unfortunate situations. So this particular topic requires careful considerations in wildlife management. There are also influences on feature detection that can occur for a species, first of which is the perceptual range. This is going to be the maximum distance that a species can detect a feature of an environment. So for things such as a cactus bug, it's a matter of up to 1 meter. And then that increases in size such that you get to fox squirrels and gray squirrels that can detect out to about 300 meters. And as you can imagine, things like birds are going to have a much greater perceptual range than some of these other land animals, and larger mammals as well, given their height as well as their acute vision or excellent vision, are able to have increased perceptual ranges. Foraging can also influence habitat selection. Species will have been described as undergoing something called the optimal foraging theory, where they maximize their fitness by adopting a foraging strategy that provides the most benefit or the most energy for the lowest cost. And ultimately, this is going to maximize the net energy gain for that species. So in this example, we have a penguin that dives to a certain depth in order to feed on a euphausid or a krill species. And as you can see in this figure, the cumulative number of krill captures will decrease over time spent in that patch. So the penguin is successful for a very long time, and then as time continues on within a specific patch, the success of that individual decreases. And we have something called diminishing returns. So there's still the same amount of effort, but not quite catching as much krill as as it was previously in that foraging kind of event. So that helps to determine the duration of foraging that these particular species undergo. There's also something called resource tracking, where an increase in energy gain is acquired for an animal by moving to track the phenological variation in resources across space. So the phenological variation is going to refer to biological events such as migrations or known periods within the cycle of an organism where there's going to be a shift or a change. So the resource dynamics can shape the animal movement across taxa and system and scales. So in this figure here in the upper left-hand corner as an example, we have a bear whose habitat selection and habitat movement is going to be dependent on the salmon populations over time and where they go. Just as another example, in the bottom right-hand side, there's a displacement as well as a spatial movement of certain species within a habitat, from one kind of breeding ground to feeding ground, things along those lines. And by tracking the movement of the resources of, say, food or temperature between those regions, you can have a good idea of habitat selection as well. Finally, we can look at gradient links, where we see that patches of habitat have underlying gradients of some kind that can influence them or that can relate to the population of animals within them. So for instance, temperature within the patch or the moisture, elevation, all of these things can have an effect on the abundance, which should be of a species, which should be proportional to that gradient. Thresholds may also exist for some gradients, resulting in the presence or absence in either extremity. So gradients and tolerances are really important to understand in order to better predict or better kind of assess how habitat selection occurs in a species. An organism may also tolerate a wide range along the gradient, but it might also prefer high values in a patch. So while gradients are oftentimes expressed as an optimal range, there are certain times where you will find populations to be more heavily weighted in the section of a patch or in a habitat where there's going to be a higher level of the ideal gradient present. So that gives us a little bit of information regarding habitat selection and how species go about determining their habitat. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.